In part B of this lecture, we looked at some of the definitions that are used by crisis intervention specialists as they define a crisis. We're going to begin to break this down now and talk about how a crisis develops and gain an understanding for our own purposes that we'll use here in our class for what is a crisis. So let's look at crisis development. First, there is a precipitating or precipitory event. That's the situation. That's what we're seeing on the outside. That's the car accident. That's the losing of the job. That's the baby being born. The precipitating event. Now, what I want you to understand, and I'm going to probably drive this home several times to make the point, that is not the crisis. Although that's perceived by people as the crisis, that is not really the crisis. That is simply the precipitating event. Secondly, comes their appraisal of the situation. What meaning a person attributes to a particular event. How do they see this birth of this new child? How do they respond to? What's their evaluation of the abortion? How do they look at the whole thing of, we went through a tornado? The precipitating event, and then their appraisal. And then their own evaluation of their coping resources. The ways and means of responding to the threatening situation or event. The adequacy of their resources affects the extent to which the event will be experienced as a crisis. Let me say that again. The adequacy of their resources affects the extent to which they will experience this event as a crisis. So, contrary to the common belief, the event itself, the hurricane, is not the crisis. The illness is not the crisis. The death of a child is not the crisis. That's the precipitating event. The crisis begins with the person's appraisal of the situation. And the crisis finally becomes full-blown crisis when that person decides that they can't deal with it. Because two people will go through the same experience. One of them will deal with it all and will be okay. The second person will suddenly find in that a crisis. What's the difference? The difference is their appraisal of the situation and their appraisal of their ability to cope with it. They both went through the same experience, but they responded very differently. One of them had adequate resources to cope. The other did not. And that person, the second person, is the person who suddenly is in crisis. What is the crisis then? It's not the event. Two people may experience the same stressor. One may be in crisis and the other not. The key element is how the person perceives their coping mechanism, and if it is inadequate or overwhelmed, they are in crisis. I know I've said that a couple of times, but that is critical. We've got to quit calling the precipitating event a crisis. The car wreck is not the crisis. The losing of the job is not the crisis. Now, from the perception of the person going through it, that's a crisis. But it's not. The reality is their perspective on it is the crisis. How they perceive it is what creates that, whether it decides whether that will be a crisis or not. So here's a little chart to help you see that. The precipitory event leads to an appraisal of the resources and coping mechanisms. And here's the key. If those coping mechanisms seem to be overwhelmed, then the person is in crisis. Only if they feel overwhelmed and unable to deal with what's going on. One person may lose their spouse and walk through and grieve, go through the natural steps of loss, and walk through the steps of taking care of the funeral and the events and the legal issues that go on with that, and just deal with it. The next person may end up in bed for a week because of it. Because the difference is one feels overwhelmed and feels unable to cope. The other feels that they can cope and does. Crisis really is a turning upside down, if you will, of your normal situation. In a normal situation, as illustrated in this chart, the precipitating event is huge, but as you begin to cope and bring to bear the resources that you have to solve the problem, it gets smaller and smaller. The opposite is true in a crisis. In a crisis, as you can see in the chart, the situation starts out with a precipitating event, but because you feel unable to cope, it just keeps getting bigger and bigger and bigger and becomes overwhelming until you are in crisis. Crisis is a turning upside down of your normal coping ability. A crisis usually involves a time frame. Usual time frame is less than 6 weeks. That's the acute phase. If it lasts longer than that, then you've got a different situation. You're not in crisis. You have a long-term chronic problem. Crisis intervention techniques are usually used during this phase to address the immediate, urgent need of the situation. Now, that's a crisis then, with its features of a precipitating event, an appraisal of the event, and overwhelming of the person's ability to cope. There's a difference then between a crisis and a problem. A crisis is not a problem. A problem may cause stress, may be difficult to solve, but the family or the individual is capable of dealing with it. The problem can be resolved by the individual or the family, and so they're not in crisis. A problem that can be solved immediately is not a crisis. It's a problem. And most people will not feel like they are in crisis because to them it's just a problem. Also, a crisis is not an emergency. An emergency is a sudden, pressing necessity, such as when a life is in danger by an accident or a suicide attempt or family violence. This requires the attention of law enforcement or perhaps of a legal agent or other professionals trained to respond to life-threatening events. That's an emergency. When you need EMS, that's an emergency, not a crisis. Now, here's the key. The emergency, once it's resolved, once the person is treated, once the accident is over, once the suicide attempt has been thwarted, there may be a resulting crisis that comes out of the emergency that may last for 6 weeks. But there's a difference between a crisis, an emergency, and a problem. If you have a precipitating event and you can deal with it immediately through the help of some kind of healthcare professional or legal professional, you have an emergency. If you can deal with it yourself and solve it through family resources, you have a problem. But if those resources do not solve the problem and you feel overwhelmed by it and unable to cope, then you're in crisis. If the situation can wait 24 to 72 hours for a response without placing an individual in jeopardy, it is probably a crisis and not an emergency. When you're in a car wreck, you need help then, not in 2 or 3 days. You need help immediately. That's an emergency. But if the situation can wait 2 or 3 days, but it's still not resolved, that's probably a crisis. So, in this lecture then, we've talked about several things. We've talked about, first of all, what a crisis is, and we've shown some definitions that are used by crisis intervention specialists. We've emphasized the fact that for our purposes, a crisis involves 3 factors. First, there's a precipitating event. Secondly, there is the perception on the part of the person that they cannot deal with it. Their appraisal is that they do not have the resources. And thirdly, the resources in fact are overwhelmed and they can't deal and they are unable to function. That's the definition, the 3-part definition that we will use in our class for a crisis. We've also learned that a crisis and a problem and an emergency are 3 different things. In our next session, we'll talk about the feelings that people have in a crisis, and we'll talk about and look at a biblical example of a crisis as we begin to analyze how a crisis unfolds.